Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The BBC understands that a former Russian spy is in a critical condition in hospital in Wiltshire, along with a woman in her 30s, after they were both taken ill at a shopping centre in Salisbury yesterday. Police say they've been exposed to an unknown substance. A major incident was declared and decontamination teams were called into the local hospital and part of the city. Our Home Affairs correspondent Tom Simons sent this report from Salisbury.
Last night, what happened here in the centre of Salisbury resulted in teams wearing full protective suits decontaminating the streets, where several areas remain cordoned off. Police, fire services and public health authorities have declared a major incident. The first signs something was wrong came yesterday afternoon when a man and woman appeared severely unwell in the Maltings area of central Salisbury. The emergency services were called and the pair were taken to hospital.
There was a couple, an older guy and a younger girl. She was sort of leant in on him. It looked like she'd passed out, maybe. He was doing some strange hand movements, looking up to the sky.
The man and woman are being treated at Salisbury District Hospital, where they're in a critical condition. She is thought to be in her 30s. The BBC has been told that he is Sergei Skripal, Russian, 66 years old. In 2006, he was convicted of high treason in Russia. The allegation was that he was a British spy. In 2010, he was pardoned by the Russian authorities and came to this country in return for the release of 10 spies from the US. The hospital has had to reduce its operations while dealing with what appears to be a suspected poisoning. Police arrived at Mr. Skripal's house in Salisbury yesterday afternoon. Wiltshire police said they were investigating whether a crime had been committed. And Sophie, I think it's fair to say that there are more unanswered questions than there are facts this evening. It is a very strange situation. A man in his 60s and a woman in her 30s found unconscious on a bench in the centre of Salisbury in a very busy shopping area with no visible signs of injury. The police have said very little about this. They have said that they don't recognise the reports that have been put out tonight around various media outlets that this was to do with the drug fentanyl, but they also say they continue to investigate, really initially, to determine whether a crime has been committed. One further thing, as far as we know at this stage, the counter-terrorism officers that police counter-terrorism in this part of the world are not involved. Sophie.
Tom Simons in Salisbury, thank you.
Well, let's turn to some breaking news now, and it's being reported that a man who is critically ill after suspected exposure to an unknown substance in a Salisbury shopping centre is a former Russian spy called Sergei Skripal. And Paul McNamara is here with more. Paul, what have you managed to find out so far?
Well, there's actually two people who are in critical condition in intensive care, but it's the identity of one of them in particular which has raised concern levels. That person is reported to be 66-year-old Sergei Skripal. He's a former Russian army colonel who's been living in the UK since 2010. The reason he's been living here is because of a spy swap that he was part of. So yesterday afternoon, members of the public called Wiltshire Police because two people have been found unconscious in the city centre. Immediately, police declared a major incident. Number of locations in the city centre and the A&E of the hospital that they were brought to, Salisbury District Hospital, were shut down and cordoned off. Now, the substance is still unknown. We've been talking to the police. They, at the moment, are not confirming what the substance is. They're not confirming the identity of the two people that were found, but it is understood that one of them is Sergei Skripal. The woman who was found with him is in her 30s, and it's understood that they are known to each other. So it's not a random member of the public who's also suspected of falling ill to whatever this substance is. Now, Sergei Skripal's background is very interesting. As I said, he's been living here since 2010. In the mid-2000s, he was convicted in Russia of passing information to British intelligence. It was reported that he he'd made $100,000 by identifying spies to MI6. He was found guilty of that. He was sentenced to 16 years in prison. But in 2010, he was part of this huge spy swap, and him and another Russian agent were brought over here. Now, of course, whenever you mention former Russian agents and mysterious substances and people falling ill, everyone starts thinking about Alexander Litvinenko, the former FSB man who was found in the streets of London, poisoned on the streets of London, sorry, in November 2006. Within 2 weeks, he was dead. Now, there is no evidence whatsoever to link these two. There is no evidence that of what the reason behind Sergei Skripal's condition today is, and the police at the moment aren't confirming any link or any reason behind that.
Well, Paul, there's a police press conference going on at the moment. We'll let you get it and have a look at that, and we'll bring more news on that as we have it.
At first glance, a wooden bench in the cathedral city of Salisbury in Wiltshire might seem a rather unlikely place for some sort of Cold War reprisal attack. But that is one potential theory on why a former Russian spy and his female companion are critically ill tonight in a local hospital. The two were found unconscious yesterday afternoon. Police say they had been exposed to an unknown substance, but more than a day later, officers still can't say what it actually was. The spy is Sergei Skripal, a double agent who passed state secrets to Britain to complete the Cold War theme. He was later swapped in a spy exchange, and he wouldn't, of course, be the first Russian spy to be poisoned here in bizarre circumstances.
Wearing layers of protective clothing, the search for what may have poisoned two people in Salisbury city centre is forensically focused tonight on a bin next to a children's play area. As we watched, these officers delicately examined and sifted through the contents, piece by piece. Whatever unknown substance they're looking for, it required multiple layers of gloves to protect those whose job it is to handle and look for potentially deadly material. This is the city centre park, where yesterday afternoon two people were found unconscious on a bench. A 33-year-old woman and a 66-year-old man, Sergei Skripal, a former Russian army colonel.
The pair, who we believe are known to each other, did not have any visible injuries and were taken to Salisbury District Hospital. They are currently being treated for suspected exposure to an unknown substance. Both are currently in a critical condition in intensive care. Because we are still at the very early stages of the investigation, we are unable to ascertain whether or not a crime has taken place.
Sergei Skripal was arrested in 2004 by Russian security services at an airport in Russia, bundled into a van and put on trial and convicted for treason. The 66-year-old was a colonel in Russian military intelligence, sentenced to 13 years for passing Russian state secrets to MI6 and exposing their agents working in the UK. But in 2010 he was involved in a prisoner swap that took place in Vienna. It saw 10 Russian agents, including British citizen Anna Chapman, exchanged for Skripal and 3 others. Former Russian security agent Alexander Litvinenko died in London in 2006, fatally poisoned with a radioactive substance, polonium-210. Similarities will be drawn with that case, which an inquest found led directly to the Kremlin, and this one in Salisbury, although it's still too early to know if it is a fair comparison. The police say they do not believe there is any risk to anyone else. But the sight in a city centre park next to a children's playground of officers wearing clothing associated with chemical and biological material is bound to alarm some. As the search continues tonight, so the questions mount. Were these two people deliberately poisoned? If so, by who and why? And has the past of a man disowned by his state led to him becoming critically ill? Rupert Evelyn, News at 10, Salisbury.
And our political correspondent, Paul Brand, joins us now from the Home Office. Paul, a most bizarre turn of events, really. Is the government shedding any light on it tonight?
No, Tom, the government insists it's trying to solve this mystery just like the rest of us this evening, led by the Home Office. And if it has uncovered any clues, well, it's not sharing them with us this evening. Safe to say that government sources and indeed security sources are not steering us away from the possibility that this was some kind of Russian reprisal, though they're urging caution at this stage because the results of toxicology tests are not yet back. We know, though, that this comes at a time of an intensifying war of words, some would say a war of much more than that, between Russia and the UK. Just this morning, the Defence Secretary, Gavin Williamson, said it was time for Britain to wake up to the Russian threat. He's accused of them of trying to spy on energy supplies, of having the potential to kill thousands through some kind of cyber attack. And before Christmas, the Prime Minister accused Russia of weaponising information, meddling in elections, proliferating fake news, and that was before the Foreign Secretary had a rather explosive meeting with his Russian counterpart in Moscow. So we know that backdrop of tension is there. The big question tonight, though, is why would it manifest itself in this particular way at this particular time, especially when Sergei Skripal has been in the UK for 8 years?
Paul, it is something of a mystery, but for now, thank you.
When a man falls ill in a shopping centre, it doesn't normally lead the news. When that man's revealed as a Russian who spied for Britain and his condition is considered critical, the whole thing becomes a little harder to ignore. Sergei Skripal was granted refuge in Britain in a spy swap between America and Russia 8 years ago. Nothing much was heard from him in that time until yesterday, when he and a woman in her 30s were found slumped on a bench in Salisbury. Police have declared a major incident. They believe they were exposed to an unknown substance, one which may yet prove untraceable. If the spectre of Alexander Litvinenko lingers on his shoulder, we should caution against being too hasty, assuming we know too much. Clearly, there are plenty of unknowns, but there is also much we need to ask. We begin with our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban.
Yesterday afternoon, passers-by noticed two people, apparently unconscious, on a bench in Salisbury. The area was investigated by people in protective suits as suspicions built that the two victims had been poisoned. They were in Salisbury Hospital tonight, described as critically ill.
We are unable to ascertain whether or not a crime has taken place. A major incident, however, has been declared today, and a multi-agency response has been coordinated.
The BBC established that the man being treated is Sergei Skripal. He was convicted by a court in Moscow in 2006 of being a spy for British intelligence. He was sent from the court to the Gulag, where he languished for 4 years. It was in 2010 that the arrest of a network of Russian agents in the United States provided an opportunity for MI6 to repay its debt to Skripal. The UK asked for his name to be added to a list of prisoners the CIA was putting together. And in July of that year, Skripal and 3 others were put on a jet from Moscow to Vienna. The 10 accused by the US of espionage, among them Anna Chapman, were flown from America, and in the best Cold War traditions, the two parties of spies crossed on the tarmac in Austria. Asked about who might have betrayed this American spy ring, President Putin vented his fury publicly.
Traitors will kick the bucket, trust me. These people betrayed their friends, their brothers in arms. Whatever they got in exchange for it, those 30 pieces of silver they were given, they will choke on them.
As for Skripal, he flew from Vienna to Britain, where he began a life in exile. Police were today securing the house in Salisbury, where the former Russian intelligence officer has lived in recent years.
Well, that was Mark Urban, and Mark's here now. Mark, you started to there, but give us a little bit more of a sense of who this man is.
Well, people who've met him talk about a tough ex-paratrooper, ex-special forces, very proud of that, who gravitated towards Russian military intelligence, the GRU. Now, if you believe the court case that was heard against him back in 2006, at some point in the late 90s, he started working for MI6, at a time when it was very hard to penetrate the GRU. I can remember talking to Western spies at the time, and they said post-Soviet collapse, this was the last element of the Russian intelligence community as it had become that was really tight and held together. So the recruitment would have been quite an achievement for MI6 at the time. And I understand that as a full colonel, he moved on to the so-called collegium, the people who run the panel that ran the GRU, and he was responsible for personnel matters. So he would have been in a position to open up the complete order of battle of the GRU in Western embassies throughout the early 2000s, throughout the early noughties, before he was caught. So while he may not be at the very top Penkovsky or Gordievsky level of British penetration, he was a pretty senior agent and pretty important to Western intelligence during those years.
We don't know what made him defect. What was he doing here latterly?
Well, of course, you can imagine somebody who is helpful to that degree to HMG will be looked after. And of course, we know that they put his name forward when these Russian agents were picked up in America in 2010. And the Russians, despite the fact that they'd convicted him for treason, agreed to send him back on the plane in order to get their agents back. Now, he would have got an MI6 pension, and I understand from people in the forces that he occasionally came and gave lectures about the GRU at military academies, and he also apparently sometimes acted as a bit of a consultant, if you like, going to talk to other intelligence services as part of his sort of consultancy almost with MI6 that he did in return for this package. Not unlike, in fact, the type of work that Litvinenko did in terms of his conversations with the Spanish, which he had as a consultant or whatever you want to call it.
And yet he's now lying critically ill in a hospital in Salisbury, found in a very public place. What is your sense then of what has gone on? What are the theories?
Well, as far as one can establish, he was a man without an enormous number of connections to other people, like in Salisbury or beyond. And he had a small nuclear family. Now, we know that his wife, Ludmila, died in 2012 and is buried in the UK. His son died last year, very early, but after an illness. People I speak to say they do not regard it as suspicious. But nevertheless, he was clearly in a vulnerable state. Only one member of that family still surviving, his daughter. And it seems to be the case that someone was seeing him last week, came to, if you like, help him out, perhaps at a difficult time after several months after the loss of his son. Now, we know that the son, although he died in Russia on a holiday there, was repatriated to this country and is buried in this country. So there are all kinds of possibilities that somehow the repatriation of the son or the visit of someone else coming from Russia to see him may have been a way that could have been used to fix his location and try and find out where he was. I mean, all of these are purely hypotheses at the moment because, as you said at the very beginning of the programme, no foul play has been proven. But if you were looking for how he might have been found, those are some of the things you might be looking at.
Mark, thank you. Stay with us. We asked the Russian government to come on Newsnight tonight. They wouldn't, unfortunately, but joining us now live from Brussels is the former MI5 agent Annie Machin, and here in the studio joined by Bill Browder, who calls himself Putin's enemy number one, whose lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was, he believed, murdered by the Russian government. Very nice of you both to join us. Bill, I'll start with you because you're right in front of me. What is your sense of what has gone on here?
Well, we don't know the details yet, but when a major enemy of Russia suddenly becomes critically ill from an unknown substance, one has to assume the worst, and one should start with the worst assumption and work their way back from that. And so I would assume, until proven otherwise, the assumption should be that this man was poisoned, that he was poisoned with some type of substance from what is known as the KGB poison factory. They have a scientific research unit in Moscow, part of the FSB, which is the successor organization of the KGB, in which they come up with poisons to assassinate their enemies. They've used these poisons here before with Litvinenko. There was another shocking death connected to my case, which was a man named Alexander Parapolichny, who dropped dead in Surrey in 2012 after blowing the whistle on a major Russian government corruption scheme. People die on a regular basis outside the country, and so we should assume, for the moment, until we know otherwise, that he's been assassinated.
You would be surprised. You would be surprised if the Russian state, in some shape or form, were not behind whatever has happened this weekend in Wiltshire.
Well, we have no information, so but the assumption, based on what we know right now, is that this was an assassination attempt.
Annie Mashon, is that going a step too far, or do you see where Bill Browder's coming from?
I think we're rather jumping the gun here, I have to say, because one, we don't know the name of the woman who was with him. We don't know what substances might have been involved. We don't know pretty much anything around this case. And it started to unfold in the media. It was just a case of two people who appeared to have taken overdose of something, it might have been spice or fentanyl, which has now been discredited, or whatever, on the streets. And I think it's only really hit the headlines because it turns out this guy is indeed a Russian defector who is being protected by MI6 in the UK after the spy swap in 2010. So I think there are many known unknowns in this case, and I think it's slightly inflammatory to start throwing around accusations, particularly in this era of Russiagate and the Trump stuff and things like that. I think also it's also understandable that there was an immediate decontamination exercise around this case. Once this person's name had been fed into the system, once he'd been taken to hospital, once the police reported it, there would have been a red flag. And of course, in the wake of the Litvinenko case, it would have been absolutely normal for the police to try and contain this issue and try and decontaminate in case there was any potential similarity to the Litvinenko case, which was hideous.
Annie, can I ask you?
We don't know that yet.
Sort of more widely, because you are from the security background, this intelligence background. Explain to us what happens in a spy swap. I mean, when these people are transferred from one country to another, what kind of protection are they given? He would have been on all the lists, presumably, for MI6, for MI5, wouldn't he?
Absolutely. I mean, from what I've seen in the reports, I don't know, you know, from the inside, obviously, from what I've seen in the reports, this guy was a high-value asset for MI6 for at least 10 years. And then he was caught and he was prosecuted and he went to prison in Russia in 2006 for identifying the names of British agents in Russia, which is, you know, the crown jewels of intelligence. So it was a very serious crime. In the UK, we would also see that as very serious crime. And then he was swapped in the 2010 spy ring case, which involved Anna Chapman and other Russian illegals being swapped for four suspects from, four convicts in Russia. So, you know, you're looking at a swap of 10 Russian illegals, allegedly, for 4 convicted people in Russia. So he must have been pretty high value.
Bill Browder, why would you assume that the state would intervene at this point? I mean, what is it, if this happened in 2008, 2010, you know, nearly a decade ago, why would this happen now?
Well, so what you have to understand about Russia is you have many, many hundreds of thousands of people who work in different branches of the security services, etc. And they're not motivated people, they're not loyal people, they're not necessarily honest people. And so unlike here and other countries where people contribute their service out of patriotism, they do so for other reasons. And so they can't assume that anyone is going to be loyal. And so the only way that Putin can assure loyalty is to absolutely viciously and completely punish disloyalty, no matter where and when and how. And so he has to create an incentive, a terrible incentive, so that everybody else around says, you know, if I in any way veer off the track, do what this guy did, then terrible things are going to befall me in the way that it's done to him.
Does that make sense to you, Annie Mashon, that this is somehow Putin reasserting a sort of a flexing of muscles? I mean, obviously, we don't know anything about foul play at this point, but as a way of operating by the Russian president?
One, it would seem unlikely in this particular case because they would not have handed him back to the West if they'd seen him as being a threat. But two, I find that a slightly bizarre statement from your other guest in the sense that, yes, a lot of patriots go and work for the intelligence agencies in America and in the UK. I mean, I was one of them, that was my motivation, and across the rest of the West. However, a lot of patriots also do the same thing in Russia. And to try and make a distinction between the motivation, I think, is slightly disingenuous.
Bill Browder.
Oh, I don't really know, you know, I can't really say for sure whose motivations are where, but what I can say for sure is that Putin, and we saw this completely and absolutely with Litvinenko, that Putin makes, the way Putin operates is to make examples out of people. and he doesn't have loyalty anywhere in his own country. His country is completely full of disloyal people who are profiting from different enterprises, etc. And so the way he goes about creating loyalty is by creating a very, very severe punishment for people who are disloyal. And he said so. We just listened to him on the television saying that exact thing, that if somebody betrays their brothers in arms, then terrible things will happen to them. There's no mystery about that.
Thank you both very much for bringing us so much this evening. Thank you.
So let's take more then with Kevin and Andrew, and we start with, well, which of the papers? I think they're all leading on it, aren't they, bar the FT?
It's a fantastic story. It's the new Cold War. Putin strikes again after Litvinenko.
Well, you don't,
2006.
2 + 2 makes 5.
I'm going to jump to a conclusion, if you forgive me. I'm going to jump to
you
that
always
conclusion.
Do.
Yes.
Why shouldn't he tonight? When he might be jumping to the right conclusion for a change.
My evidence is that Litvinenko, this man was never going to be forgiven by Putin. He was a double spy, an important double agent who sold out many of his own agents in return for money, presumably. He, according to the Daily Mail, on its front page, told people in the last few days he feared for his life. We know that Putin killed Litvinenko, was killed in a hotel, a pot of tea, I think, in the Millennium Hotel. This has happened in a shopping centre in Salisbury. Even more shocking, frankly. Cece's restaurant, ordinary restaurant that people go to. You don't expect it to happen there.
It may not be the source, though.
No,
they will retrace his steps.
Yeah, the point is that the Zizi has this evening been closed to be investigated.
But he was with a young woman who's thought to be a relative, possibly his daughter. Terrible for her. What's it got to do with her? And it just shows Putin, the former KGB man, is always going to be a KGB man. He's struck fear in the heart of all Russians who've turned against him. He wants to wage fear at home and also abroad. This is a man who can interfere, we think, with American elections, and now he can kill yet again in broad daylight. Well, he's not dead yet, but potentially has killed somebody else.
That's 2 + 2 = 6.
Yeah, I know, but it is.
I don't think he's going to make it.
It's McMafia with knobs on it, and absolutely sensational. With, we can say suspected poisoning, but
I think we can assume it.
Yeah, I know. We can.
Found unconscious on a bench in a shopping centre.
And in Salisbury, normally famous for just its cathedral, that wonderful spire and so on. But if it is a hit from the Russians and the Kremlin, and you'd be amazed. You'd be amazed if it was a hit that Putin didn't know. You'd have to be a very brave SBS operative to go ahead with this without him being aware. If it is, it just strikes fear. It shows nobody is safe because it's so mundane. If it is a drink or something you've eaten, or we saw with Kim Jong-un's relative who had a cloth with a spray put in his face. It's not looking for someone with a gun or a bomb.
Yes,
and there he is.
There's he is, but there's also the picture of the emergency services who are fully suited up in their
in a bio.
Terrifying for them too, actually, because they don't know what they're fighting.
You have to protect them, and they don't know. This happened on Sunday, about 4:15 on Sunday. It's just come out now. Brilliant for the morning papers, it's got to be said, that it wasn't out this morning or the lunchtime. It comes out now. They've got to find out what that substance is. So they're not entirely sure what they're looking for.
Because there's no physical injuries on this guy. He was a double agent. He was in prison in Russia. He was released as part of an agent swap. Putin never quite gets the spirit of these agent swaps, does he? So
well, perhaps he does.
Bided his time,
playing by his own
and got his man
rules.
Yeah, he's a ruthless killer.
He was
Putin.
sentenced to 13 years because he cooperated. But inside the Mail say dozens of agents he gave up, including Anna Chapman, the glamorous spy in the States, and you'll never be forgiven for turning on your own. It's what Kim Philby, who was Britain's great traitor, would do.
And that's the worst accusation, that you identify Russian agents across Europe, which is what he was accused of.
And it is your own. You're giving up your own. They end up in prison. Hugely embarrassing for the Russians when the Americans picked up Anna Chapman, who was a socialite diplomat's daughter, all the others in the States. You have to get him back. You have to trade some of yours. They don't want to do that.
In terms of how the newspapers handle it, different pictures they've chosen, the Mail and a number of them, the court case, the other one, the sort of still of him as a colonel, the biosuits for the other, and there's the Guardian as well. But if we go back to the Daily Mail, how does a newspaper throw ahead In the Daily Mail, they're talking about he'd told agents just weeks ago that his life was in danger. But it's details like that newspapers are after, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, there's 4 bylines on this story, so they've thrown everything at it, and there's a lot more inside too. You can just know there's going to be a huge presence from the hacks tomorrow in Salisbury. But they'll be talking to their contacts in MI6. MI5... Foreign Office. I mean, this man would not have just been under observation by the Russians. Our spooks would have known exactly where he was too, because he clearly, from what he's told the Mail, felt he was at risk.
Look, you flood the zone, you speak to everybody, all his friends, his relatives, if he had any workmates. I think he had a pension, so perhaps he didn't work, but certainly his neighbours. He bought a house in Salisbury. So you want to get as close there as you can.
Lived here for nearly 8 years.
Under
so
his own name, presumably?
Well, I don't know.
Or these are the questions that still need to be
answered. But he'd have formed his own life here. But did he ever really think he'd escaped the clutches of the evil Putin? Clearly not, because, as I say, the Mail said he said weeks ago he told agents. So he was still talking to our people the whole time. He was in trouble.
There is a history of spies when they defect, or in his case is traded to get him to Britain, which he betrayed his own country for money
to get
secrets to Britain. Let's not sugarcoat that. You might think it's great he did it, but that's what he did. But there is a long history of they defect or like this. They're not very happy. They're being cut off from their home, their family, and everybody they knew. They'd rather be back.
I think Philby, if he was honest, probably would regretted the whole thing, because I think he was a miserable spy in Russia.
Edward Snowden, a different case, of course.
Yeah, and of course,
leaks, but
and of course, this guy gave up people, and of course, there was the criticism against people like Edward Snowden is that they exposed through the WikiLeaks security operatives in the field to danger. That's been a point that MI6 have always maintained.
But with Snowden, I don't remember many names. The accusation against WikiLeaks was just a data dump. So names were in there, including people who weren't spooks, but they were activists, civic society activists and so on, and they would be exposed.
OK, so let's go... Yeah, if we go to The Guardian, then The Mirror, and then the inside pages, pretty much the same story for everybody. Unknown substance leaves former Russian spy critically ill in the UK. The question is what? Because polonium-210 in the Alexander Litvinenko case became eminently traceable. BA flights being cleared and decontaminated, Itsu, Millennium Hotel and so on. The question is what was the likely substance in
the
this?
Sun Inside asked, was it polonium-210? Now, of course, we haven't got a clue, but I think
it's an obvious question.
It's a fair enough question to ask. Now, if it is, presumably you have to go in with a Geiger counter. It'll begin clicking away, and you'd find that pretty quickly. But you would hope they would.
And The Sun, of course, have got the sex appeal in this piece. That's great for their readers. There's Anna Chapman, the spy he gave up. She just
remind us about her, if you can.
She was She was in America, I think, wasn't she, Kevin?
Yeah, she was a socialite in New York, I think it was. And she was one of the Russians' great spies.
Yeah, she was very successful, very high.
Quite a big ring.
Yeah, and she just conforms to every tabloid, if you like, perception of what a female spy is. Matahari, a bit of a Matahari here. Yeah, I mean, she's very glamorous, and of course her glamour helped her, I'm sure, in her spying.
No, that's right. But
part of the essential part of spying can be the use of sex, of course, and a very sexy woman.
Hide in plain sight. Would you, if you're looking for a spy, would you think it was an attractive woman? No, you probably think it's a male of some
you probably think it's an ugly old Russian.
Well, there we are.
Like Sergei. Yeah. So, to be honest, I mean, I know 2 people are fighting for their lives, but it is a fantastic newspaper story. It has so much. The Cold War is back on our shores. 10 years ago, Litvinenko died in this country. They've never got the killers. We think at least one of them is an MP in the Russian parliament, which shows what Putin thinks about our diplomatic efforts. Go stuff yourself. He doesn't care.
Can't be extradited. But yeah, you're quite right. 2 people are fighting for their lives, but there's massive ramifications, diplomatic
relations between Britain and Russia were poor anyway. They've been in the cold freeze for a long time. They're now about to go back in it.
But exactly what do? Do you expel somebody? They just expel somebody else.
The Sun talks about Russia's thirst for revenge. Similar questions being posed in the Daily Mail's inside pages as well.
Tomorrow, of course, the ambassador will be called in to be given a dressing down by the Foreign Secretary.
He knows nothing.
He won't care. He doesn't know anything about it, and he'll deny all knowledge of it, of course.
And actually may not, but there we are. But may. But no, I think it's there on the right-hand side. He's allegedly received £78,000 in exchange for information for MI6. If there are any other Russian agents from the FSB working for MI6, they will be very nervous now.
Not just in this country either.
So you can see there is a terrible understanding of why the Russians do this. It's beyond what we would consider acceptable behaviour, but the CIA used to bum people off.
Yeah,
I've no doubt the British security services have in the past.
Mossad
Mossad, the Israelis
but
did
any
it to take
agent
out their
in Russia
enemies.
thinking of becoming a double agent is going to look at what's happened to this guy and Litvinenko and think twice. That's why Putin's doing it.
Is £78,000 worth it?
Yeah, exactly. And he's he's just not...
£178,000 next time.
He's enforcing his reign of terror as the old KGB crook that he is, not just in Russia, but all around the world.
Yes, it's of its era, but as you say, it feels like it's back in many respects.
Yeah, it does.
But it's never really gone away, has it?
No. Do you think we had a period of calm?
No, we just thought we had. When Russia was collapsing in on itself, and of course...
Yeltsin era and...
with just a drunk giving away all the money. But, of course, Putin's attempted to restore some order and also get Russia...
order and pride.
Yeah, well, you can understand that with Russia.
Interesting, just before we go, the Defence Secretary, Gavin Williamson, very new at the job, very ambitious, wants to be Tory leader. He said yesterday that the country needs to, quote, match what Putin is doing with Russian forces.
He said this before as well, hasn't he?
What? We're going to start bumping off their spies?
You're going to invade?
That means invest properly in the armed forces, doesn't it?
Right.
But he's been saying that Russia's the real threat for a while.
He has been.
Yeah.
And this will prove his point.
We've got the 6th biggest defence budget in the world already.
Not big enough.
Anyway, we still don't know what's happened.
No.
2 plus
we
2
do.
equals 5
Putin's bumped somebody off.
You're right, but I don't think there's going to be gastroenteritis.
Okay.
No.